Hello, this is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give you our analysis and debrief of what was discussed last night at the September Committee of the Whole meeting in 2021. So, Heather, it was great to see you in person and be at the board meeting together. How are you doing this morning?
Good, good.
Good. So there were a couple of things that were covered that if you want to check out our recap, you can. But we want to really focus in on what we thought the bulk of the conversation and what really stood out to us today on was the vision, the discussion around the vision for the strategic plan. And so I can pull that up. But Heather, do you want to talk a little bit about what we heard and why we want to focus a little bit on the vision right now?
Yeah, so there was a really long conversation about these two words, like well-rounded, right? And like, so what is a well-rounded education? And we know we've had a long conversation about defining a quality education, right? And so there was a lot of conversation about that word well-rounded. What did you think about that conversation, or where did you kind of land?
Yeah, and so I think for me, the term well-rounded is like now become just like an education jargon term. I think what the district and what people want us to, feel around what well-rounded means is like we can't ignore the arts, we can't ignore music, we can't ignore the social emotional learning, we can't ignore life skills. And I think that's what people really want to have included when we talk about a well-rounded education. But at the same time, I think having this like umbrella term really hides some of the things that we know our focus is that Minneapolis Public Schools has to do. And one of the things that they talked about during the board retreat was around foundational academics. And I think, again, if you listen to our shorter video, you heard us talk about Director Elameen's point around, look, Minneapolis Public Schools actually serves white students better than almost any urban district across the country. But what are we doing for our Black students? What are we doing for our Indigenous students? What are we doing for our Latinx students? And I think, what are we doing for our Asian students, right? Like, I think those are real questions that, a well-rounded education has served some students, and we thought that it would serve other students well, but it up until this point, it hasn't. And so I think Director Elameen's question around like, is this what we should be trying to provide? Is this like the thing? I mean, we can continue to focus on people's mental and social well-being, but maybe we should do so in service of making sure that they are getting the academic rigorous programming that they deserve, and so that they can, after graduation, have real choices about what they want to do. So those are my initial thoughts on what I thought the conversation around well-rounded it really centers on.
Yeah, and I just think language matters so much, right? And then, so then let's sort of talk about other language that was involved last night, right? So we talked about well-rounded. There was this word that Director Ains brought up last night. He was like, so we have been naming anti-racism as a value, and we saw it many other points in the presentation, but then we didn't see it last night in this vision. And I really do think there's something interesting in explicitly naming that we want to value an anti-racist education. And again, I think for me this comes down to like our data shows, right? That our students of color are suspended so disproportionately more. We see that our families of color feel welcome in a building so disproportionately less. And so to name anti-racism as a part of that conversation, right, feels necessary, because otherwise this feels entirely too neutral, right? We have a value in our coalition when we want to talk about like race neutral policies are racism, because the policies themselves were set up to advantage white students. And so I think the word anti-racist really needs to be in that vision, because to leave it out is to not acknowledge the existence that we have currently.
Yeah, and I think the term anti-racist also really points at disrupting when people see, like it's an active verb, or it's an active term, right? And so it's not just like a value that we hold dearly in our hearts quietly, and we put it in the corner, but it points to like how we actually need to be actively disrupting people's behaviors, systemic racism and all these different things. And if the board is is saying like this needs to be part of the vision, then I think we can hold the board accountable, we can hold the district accountable, even more so than we already could around some of these things. I think the challenge is it's nice, right? I think it's like the challenge of like the like white liberal, right? Like I think it's fine to put anti-racist in that. I think it's a great idea to put anti-racist in the vision. Does everyone have the same understanding of what anti-racism actually means? Do we all have the same understanding of what equity means, right? Like, and I think like that is a real question for me, because if everyone doesn't, and even if the board doesn't try to identify or define what that means to them, then people are going to try to hold them accountable in certain ways around certain things, and then they're going to be like, look, that's not what we meant here. And that always happens because we put out fluffy language, we put out language that we admire it. It's kind of this like liberal gaze around like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. But then like when it comes to the accountability and the actions, they're not aligned to it. And we realize, oh, we actually didn't have a shared definition around all this stuff. And so I think that's one of my concerns. I will say yesterday was a good first step because I think it needs to be in there. And now we have to see how is that aligned, and how are we actually building a culture around a shared understanding of what it means to be anti-racist, and how we're holding especially adults in the organization accountable around that.
Yeah, and I think this kind of comes back to like we need a shared understanding. And then I also think like we need a shared reality, or a sort of a shared, like, are we all coming from the same place? And I think it's really important to remember that the language of equity is so easy to co-opt, right? And it's so
Exactly.
easy to like take it
Yep.
and use it for whatever fits your agenda. And
Totally.
so you know, I think one of the things that we want to make sure that we talk about is the fact that like one of the most pivotal ways to be anti-racist in this district is that our students graduate with the abilities and the skills that they need in order to live the life that they dream of, right?
Mm,
And so we
mm,
can't sit back and say that I am an anti-racist teacher, or we are an anti-racist district, if we are not providing a quality education for students of color, if their literacy and their liberation are connected and we are not giving them literacy, right? Or if we try to, and I'm gonna bring up something that happened in contract negotiations just a few days ago that's still really sitting with me. When we say um, that learning loss, when a teacher in our district says like you can't say learning loss happened because I had an experience in my home where my child learned something else, and I think the example was
doing
learn how to do
laundry.
a load of laundry. um, so yes, learning loss did happen if kids can't read and write at grade level. And I think that we need to be really clear that anti-racism is not having a Black Lives Matter sign in your yard. It is producing global ready citizens with taxpayer dollars. And we cannot point to a district in which like half of our kindergartners don't know their letter names and sounds and say we aren't going to talk about anything else because my kid learned how to do laundry during the pandemic.
Yeah. And I think that's why words matter, especially in this vision, because to your point, that was an actual conversation in a policy conversation, a policy discussion, a policy negotiation last week around around this idea around like we don't agree about what learning loss is, because I fundamentally disagree that learning loss took place because my child learned other life skills such as doing laundry, right? And I think that's the core of Director Elameen's point, is that, yeah, look, we must not all agree what well-rounded education means. It's like those are comments that are being made while we're ignoring the like literacy losses that took place over the pandemic, the math, the numeric sense numbers or skills that took place during the pandemic, and also even understanding like like all the opportunities to understand and experience science, and to like grappling with social studies and all these different things. Like those are very, very real things. And so I think words matter there. And I think it's really important, and to the same going back to the same discussion because it's just so recent and raw, is, it's really important that we have anti-racist and we all understand what anti-racist means, because during last week's contract negotiation, we saw Senior Officer Moore, a Black man, go in and say, like, hey, can we please bring back the conversation around teachers of color? And our white union leader, teacher union leader, Greta Callahan, said, took offense to that and said, this is not an either or conversation, and you're using tools of white supremacy to make it an either or conversation. When all Senior Officer Moore said is, like, can we bring back the conversation around teachers of color? And so I have a real issue if we're not going, like, that is the type of like racism that actually has to be disrupted in Minneapolis public schools, where a Black man is asking for us to refocus on teachers of color in this policy discussion. And a white woman says, no, you're actually being racist. You're using terms of white supremacy. Like, those are things that actually have to be disrupted. And those are things that happened, 5 days ago, 6 days ago at this point?
Publicly.
And like, that is the importance of the vision, right? And like, how does that then change those conversations and the interactions that are happening in our classrooms, the interactions that are happening amongst our administrators and amongst our staff? So yeah, we have a lot of work to do. And I think that's where I struggle with. I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think that's where I'm really struggling with, like, can we actually identify this, like, how we're going to be anti-racist and how we're going to hold people accountable to being anti-racist in those settings? And that's going to be more than just a policy shift. That has to be a culture shift, that everyone is taking on that challenge of disrupting those types of conversations, those types of interactions, so that we can better serve our most vulnerable populations. And that's what this work is. That's what this work has to be, is around disrupting systems of inequity in order to serve our populations who have been ignored for so long.
And I think there's no way around that. Like, students of color need to be believed, right? Students and families of color need to be believed, and they need to be honored, and they need to see themselves. I mean, right? So like, these are kind of all the things that we're talking about. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, I'm glad our board is having this discussion, especially even now. Like, they've had so much. It would be so much easier for them, I think, to say, like, pause everything, right? Pause everything because the pandemic. But we're still continuing to go forward. It's not perfect. Like you and I talked about, like, board members, we're working all of these things out, and we're having these conversations. Long way to go. We need to have the same, like, sort of understanding, but I think language is so important. It's a great, I mean, even Senior Officer Moore said it last night, right? Like, until you have language around it, you can't address it, you can't name it, you can't change it. And so I think we have a long way to go, but at least we're having the conversation.
Yeah. Yep. Well, that's it for our debrief. Catch us next time for the October board meeting. But thanks for doing this with me today, Heather.